Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. In the last episode, we worked on some pretty major coaster builds, put down Wicked Twister, Valraven Corkscrew, and of course, the Giant Wheel. Today we're going to keep that momentum rolling and get some more major coasters installed. It's finally time to bite the bullet and work on what is probably going to be the most difficult part of the park to lay out, and that is just everything that's behind the Skyride. Specifically the area around Iron Dragon and Rougarou with the diagonal path that goes that way. Fortunately, having Corkscrew built in the last episode gave us a pretty good start as far as figuring out where these coasters are going to go. I mentioned having concerns about the turnaround for Iron Dragon, which goes over the water behind the Skyride. Took me a couple tries to figure it out, but I think we managed to get something that kind of works okay. And we're still using the terrain painting tool to figure out where these buildings and paths are going to go, showing why it's definitely important to paint these things out without actually building anything first, so it's really easy to adjust on the fly. We're going to be moving a lot of buildings around, but since there aren't any actual buildings there, it's going to make things a lot easier for me, so that's super nice. Also, want to give another shout out to Google Maps 3D view for Cedar Point. The layout for Iron Dragon could have been a little bit hard to figure out if we were just going off of the POV because it's just in the middle of a bunch of trees. But the 3D view of it on Google Maps is actually really good. It's not the most complicated coaster, but still having that as our guide to make the RCT build made things real easy. It takes the layout pretty slowly. I'm not sure if that's something that's going to be super easy to fix, but again, I'm going to come back to this probably at some point and tweak the layout a little bit. Some of the shapes of the hills and things are not ideal, so fortunately it doesn't really interact with any other parts of the park, so it's pretty easy to tweak on its own if we need to do so. And since we were over here, I also decided to start work on Rougarou. This one was pretty challenging to lay out initially. The real life chain lift is sort of on the diagonal, and it's really tough to shoehorn that into the orthogonal grid of RCT, especially since it is immediately followed by a vertical loop, which definitely can't be done on the diagonal. I was able to shift things around enough that it worked out pretty well. I don't think we'll have to adjust a whole lot as far as the path goes, but just moving the coaster back a little bit into the woods helped out quite a lot. This was also just a really fun coaster to build. If you haven't tried building any of these coasters yet, Rougarou is one that I would suggest you try your hand at for sure. It has one problematic element, which is the Immelman, since it, like Valraven, requires like a huge corkscrew to really do correctly, so faked that with just a barrel roll. Worked out okay though, I think. The part of the coaster after the mid-course brake run is a very interesting kind of spaghetti bowl mess of track. Kind of a little puzzle to figure out as far as building an RCT, but I enjoyed it quite a lot. And as we've been building these coaster layouts, looking at the map and comparing how the terrain follows the coaster layouts, I've been adding this river sort of thing. I'm not really sure if it's a river or a weird lake, who knows. The water has actually been really helpful in acting as a guide for the park layout. It really helps to connect the coasters together, since we can look at where they are in relation to that body of water and kind of sculpt the water around it if we need to. So that turned out to be a surprisingly useful piece of the puzzle there. Thanks, water. So with Rougarou down, the midway that goes between it and Millennium Force kind of builds itself here, so I figured if we're going to be laying out that part of the midway, we might as well at least start with Millennium Force. I wasn't expecting to finish it, and I guess you couldn't really call it finished anyway, because as I always say, these layouts are going to change, and Millennium Force is definitely the one that I am least happy with for a couple of reasons. And I don't know if there's a lot we can do about the problems I have with this build. One of them is the lift hill, the first hill. The chain lift slope we have in RCT is either too steep or too shallow for Millennium Force. The real coaster is at like a 45-degree angle with a almost 90-degree drop. Can't do either of those things with the Giga Coaster, so we're just doing a steep up and steep down, and it really, really doesn't look good. I'm not very happy with the way that looks in the game. but again, I'm not sure if there's really anything we can do about it. Probably have to look at some other reference parks and see if there's any tips and tricks I can find. If you have any ideas for how to make the Millennium Force lift hill look not like garbage, please let me know. I am really curious if there is any way to fix that. The other issue I have with this build so far is just the fact that the scale of the coaster is so large, and hills in RCT are only so big. They look really awkward and janky. The transitions between different angles of track pieces looks really angular, very unnatural. It doesn't look very comfortable to ride. So we wind up with a build that's, you know, functional, technically functional, but I'm not very thrilled with the end result as far as eye appeal goes. So we'll see. This is definitely one that I'll be coming back to for sure to tweak. We've already had to make a couple concessions with it as far as layout goes. I ran into a point where, because of the angle that Top Thrill Dragster wound up being at compared to Millennium Force, they actually intersected with each other a little bit, so had to make a decision on how to change the layout a little bit, change some of the angles of the turns. Worked out pretty well in the end, but I was still surprised to see them occupying the same space at one point, because normally you don't think of them coming close to each other, but it turns out that they do. Speaking of, we also did get a functioning build for Top Thrill Dragster. Very simple coaster to build, if you know the tips and tricks to get it functioning correctly. The Giga coaster doesn't have vertical track, so we're using some dummy track to act as a filler for the vertical sections up the top hat. But the boosters fortunately go more than fast enough to get us over that top hat. And with all the brakes, block brakes, everything worked out just fine. Gets terrible stats because it doesn't meet all the stat requirements for a Giga coaster. There's probably a way to fix that by changing it to a different type in the game, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. Getting good stats is very, very low on my priority list. I don't really care much about that, especially if it isn't really going to affect how peeps interact with the park. But that is going to do it for all the builds that we have today. Got a lot of stuff done, which is really nice. Hopefully that will help making the pathing to this part of the park a little bit more functional, a bit easier to build out. We don't have guests up here yet. Even with the path that we already have, we're starting to see a lot of issues with guests getting stuck and lost. And not just in the restaurant, as I mentioned earlier. They're getting stuck around just like the flower beds and things, because with the way that the pathfinding works and with wide paths, they just can't seem to make it to the exit of the park once they're done. Maybe one day that'll get changed in the game's code. Maybe not. I really don't want to add like underground paths if I can help it. I know a lot of people do that in larger parks to prevent guests getting lost and make it easier for them to pathfind the way around. I'm planning on filling my underground with shoestring rides in the future, so I don't want to clutter it up with paths too. That's just going to make things a lot more complicated for me by the time we get to that point. So I'm just going to deal with guests being mad for the majority of this park build, I think, and see how things go. Right now, I just want to focus on getting a nice looking layout, some nice looking rides, and then eventually some nice looking scenery. And then if we got time left and motivation to do so, we can think about guest pathing, but that's very, very, very far in the future. Anyway, let's go ahead and end on some ride-ons. It'll be interesting to compare these ride-ons to the ones we'll have at the end of the project to see if they are going to differ a whole lot. As always, if you've got any suggestions or questions, anything like that, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.